Presentation for the day. And this is a tag team approach where we're going to have Tim and Nancy and Peter kind of explain their rather broad project that encompasses multiple different aspects of the fresh pack process. And maybe Nancy, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. So Tim, if you want to pull up your slides, I can just give us a quick background. Thank you to WB Pans and Peter for the chance to present today. It's been a really interesting day so far with some great information. When WB Pans approached us last year to examine, I guess it was late in the year before, to examine some packaging opportunities for the fresh and fresh frozen wild blueberries, we had to ask ourselves a few key questions. So the first thing that came up was, what is the risk associated in terms of food safety around dry sorting blueberries? Has this been looked at before? And are there any, is there any space for improvements in the food safety related practices that are done? And secondly, what opportunities exist to market wild blueberries in a more full way? And how can packaging influence that success? So to answer these questions, we partnered with a couple of experts. Dr. Tim Ellis is with the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada out of Kentville, and Tim is in the food microbiology group, and he's a research scientist. So Tim and I actually, side note, met 30 years ago on a wild blueberry project. So we're coming full circle on this one. And Tim's going to walk us through the research that we did last summer around a microbial survey at various farms around the province. And then Peter Chapman is the owner of Sku Foods, and Peter has expertise in retail marketing. He's an author, speaker, and consultant who loves to help others succeed in the food business. And Peter and I have also worked together for many years and have certainly spent some time on blueberries together. So Peter's going to cover some marketing considerations from a more retail perspective. He has some experience from both sides of the table there. I am in the product development group at Perennia, but I have some background in post-harvest work and I've spent lots of time with blueberries. So to work on this project, within Perennia, I certainly got lots of help from various team members, including folks from the food safety group and our ag group, as well as our analytical group. So thanks to all the team members that helped with that. And Tim, if you want to just go forward to the next slide, please. These are all the various partners. So thank you to the funding, which came from the Building Tomorrow Fund through WB Pans. And in addition to all the partners I already mentioned and our staff at Perennia, thank you very much to the participating farms who allowed us to go in and do our initial survey and then come back and take samples. And it was during a very busy time. So we appreciate all the input and we learned a lot from you. So thanks to all of you. And with that, I will leave it with Tim, and he's going to walk us through the microbial risk assessment that was done last summer.
Okay. Thank you for the invite to this meeting. And as Nancy said, it was 1991 when I started with Agriculture Canada in Kentville, working. Eric Jackson, the microbiologist, had hired me as a technician for a wild blueberry project at the time. So 30 years later, here we are again. Just to give a little bit of background here, Nancy came to me last winter, I guess, and wanted to kind of assess, wanted to know what food safety related things could be done with the blueberry project in which she had money for. So we discussed about the increasing the desire, I guess, to increase the amount of fresh packed berries on the marketplace. And as we all know, blueberries are an incredibly important agricultural crop to Nova Scotia. And I've just highlighted a few things here that everybody is aware of. I'm sure that most of that harvest is going for individually quick frozen product. And a small fraction is actually reaching the lucrative fresh pack market. And in this case, as Yvonne nicely pointed out, the berries have to be of certain quality to basically to be marketed in that regard. So from the perspective of CFI and Health Canada, fresh packed wild blueberries would be a ready-to-eat product. And definition of ready to eat in that sense means that there's no further processing that would reduce the chance, I guess, of acquiring a foodborne pathogen. So there's no cooking process unless you're baking it into a product that would kill microorganisms. So so therefore, there is a potential risk because you're going to be consuming the berries with what is naturally on the berries that cannot be removed. Now, blueberries are not, they're not as high risk, certainly as other products out there. For example, leafy greens, the #1 risk group in terms of the FDA's top 10 list, I guess, for risky foods. Because in that case, leafy greens, there's a lot of irrigation, manure spread onto fields, and that sort of thing, which would be probably the most common sources of contamination. But when you're looking at blueberries, you're not looking at widespread irrigation or the application of animal manures to the fields. That contamination on blueberries is going to come from natural sources, wild animals wandering into fields, or if they're adjacent to other agricultural operations, you could get runoffs, and heavy rainfall and so on and so forth that could contaminate the soil. So that soil, if contaminated, becomes the source that can be picked up by harvesters and transferred onto the berries. Another potential source of contamination would also be worker hygiene. Make sure that people are washing their hands and so on and so forth when they, on a regular basis when they're out there handling the berries or in the processing facility itself. And of course, sanitation of equipment, whether it be in the field with the rakes and harvesters themselves, or in the processing plants, along the lines where you could get biofilms of bacteria building up in difficult to clean places. So in that top 10 list, berry crops actually rank as number 10, according to the FDA, or the USDA, I should say. And that's mainly because of imported berries. Strawberries and raspberries have been implicated in many outbreaks of, usually it's enteric viruses such as hepatitis A or norovirus, or parasites. The most common would be cyclospora. I believe there was a large outbreak, about 15 years ago. I think that there was a recall on the Canadian market as well for raspberries that had come from Guatemala. Blueberries are not immune to being contaminated with different pathogens. I've highlighted a couple of the bigger outbreaks, multi-state outbreaks in the US involving contamination with salmonella. And in way back in 1984, and this is based on epidemiological data that they backtracked listeriosis outbreak, and according to the data, they although they don't have direct evidence, there's indirect evidence that that outbreak was caused by contaminated blueberries. Excuse me. And the other side of the factor isn't just in terms of if you're a producer or processor, it's not just about outbreaks. Recalls are a common event where can be quite costly to end up pulling your product off of the market after a particular pathogen has been detected. And in most cases in recent years where blueberries have been involved, it's been in frozen fruit, mixed fruit packages. So whether that contamination came from the blueberries or the other berries in the package is in question. So there have been a few from the perspective of what's been done in terms of risk assessments, and blueberries are not something that there's been a lot of focus on, probably because there has been a fairly low incidence of actually blueberries being identified as a vector for foodborne outbreak. So and certainly there's been nothing done on Nova Scotian berries in that regard. The only evidence or the only surveys I could actually find, there was one done on Maine blueberries, but that was strictly for IQF. And more recently, there was a study in Georgia that was conducted on berries targeting the fresh market. So we thought that it would be a good idea to actually do a survey on Nova Scotia blueberries to see, in general, what sort of microbial loads are on the berries and the frequency of detection of human pathogens. And usually, in this regard, we used indicator organisms mainly for that.
Tim, you might want to pick it up a little. You're about halfway through your time.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
So to establish our general numbers, we basically wanted to look at the microbial loads on berries in the field that we harvested ourselves. We also wanted to look at the harvesting practices involved, so in particular gentle harvesting practices, how this relates to those microbial numbers on the berries. And we compare that with berries that were harvested by traditional mechanical harvesters, and also berries that were coming out the end of the processing line. And this was all done looking at the berries, and we also wanted to look at the berry contact surfaces within the processing facility. So for the berries that we raked in the fields, we used sanitized rakes, everyone using gloved hands. We sieved the berries through a grid so that we winnowed out any leaves or stems to try to get an unrealistic approach to harvesting, but it was kind of like we wanted to compare if you took all of the extreme measures in harvesting to lower the risk, I guess, of picking up other debris. So in all we had originally 6 farms involved, and one had to drop out due to technological issues. So we collected 350 field samples, either directly out of the fields or those from the blowers at the processing plants. We collected 34 fully processed samples, and then environmental samples from berry contact surfaces. So we want to look at total plate counts, yeast and mold counts, coliform and E. coli counts as fecal indicators, and also Listeria monocytogenes detection, as it is a common processing plant issue. So looking at the results, the impact of season, the red bars are those that were harvested early in the season, and the green are late harvest berries. So as you can see in general, right across the board, yeast and molds and aerobic bacteria, early season berries had significantly higher counts than the late season berries. If you look at the method of harvest, our careful harvesting, using sanitized rakes, it was typically lower counts than any other method. But in general, the gentle harvester techniques did reduce the numbers. If you compare, say, mechanically harvested berries versus gentle harvested berries, you can see a drop there, as well as with the yeast and mold counts. We attribute probably the higher counts early season was we were having a very hot run of days, and the field heat being removed from our samples in the coolers just wasn't happening. And a lot of the berries were coming back to the lab quite warm after sitting for an extended period of time. Okay, so again, looking at coliform counts, which is an indicator of general hygiene, and E. coli counts, which would be your fecal contamination. We were getting a fairly high level, I guess, of coliform detection on the hand rake berries that we did, 25%, and from the harvesters, 65% on the gentle harvesters, or 68% on gentle harvesters, and 84% on the traditional mechanical harvesters. So again, picking up less debris, less material does reduce those numbers. The good news is that rarely did we find fecal contamination. One site here, we had 3 positive E. coli samples, but in general, those numbers were extremely low. On the mechanical harvesters, 18% of those samples actually, we detected fecal contamination. And again, good news, no Shiga producing E. coli, which is a pathogen, and no salmonella were detected. Okay, fully processed berries. Again, we 22 out of 34 samples that we took were positive for coliforms. We only found 1 sample that actually had E. coli, and it had an extremely high number of coliforms, 10 to the 5th here, in excess of 10 to the 5th. And when we went back in and redid the sample from a duplicate packet from the same time, we actually could not detect E. coli again, nor were the coliforms numbers very high in that sample. So we kind of think we might have picked up a berry sample that probably had direct fecal contaminant in it, possibly rabbit or deer dropping. Could be a possible explanation, but it was kind of a one-off sample. And again, no Listeria were detected in any of these samples, which is a good thing.
And we're getting low on time, so if you can try to wrap it up shortly.
Yeah, okay. So environmental sampling, we concentrated on 4 different areas of the processing line. And for some reason, we were getting high levels of detection this is relative light units for ATP detection. So on 2 different sites, it was that sizer that appeared to be the culprit. Environmental sponges from the same processing lines. We had 3 samples that actually picked up listeria off of the belts, and 1 late season sample where we found listeria in a tout. We're in the process of right now of typing these strains, and here this is we use PCR to serotype all of the samples, and as you can see, these first 3 samples are all of the same serotype, whereas this one, different set of primers used, different serotype. So we're further trying to characterize these to see if it's the same strain, to see if there was a persistence issue where listeria entered the plant and remained for a period of time. Okay, so to conclude, time of season definitely impacted the numbers of microflora on the berries, and the high general aerobic plate counts and yeast and mold counts correlated with our higher coliform numbers, although those numbers were not excessively high. And so we think delays in getting the berries to the line probably contributed to that early season observation. Gentle harvesting methods definitely does reduce the number of bacteria on the berries. We think that, you know, this is an area where we can further look for improvements to lower those numbers. High frequency of coliforms that we did find, but CFIA recommends less than 100 CFUs per gram, and we were finding between 100 and 1,000. However, that recommendation does not apply to produce. The less than 100 CFUs generally applies to dairy products, meat, but there's just too much. It's recognized that fruits and vegetables will have high carriage of bacteria just by the nature of the product. Fecal contamination extremely low. So, and we didn't detect any pathogens in this regard. So, the carriage, the risk, I would say, is low, but it should not be, basically considered that there is no risk there. Our processing samples, processing line sampling showed that there were areas that could be targeted, like the sizers appear to be a hotspot. And we did find listeria on the raw material, or the belts with raw material coming through. So that would be a focal point for further sanitation measures. Okay. So if we were to continue work, I think it's that environmental aspect that is what we would like to concentrate on. Can't really control the number of bacteria on the berries in the field, the natural contamination, but we can do things along the way, such as cleaning equipment, harvesting and processing equipment that will reduce the risk and probably relate to a better product in the end, because lower microbial loads should mean, a little bit of an improvement on shelf life of the product.
Thank you, Tim. I think we're going to have to leave it there. So we have time for Peter. Maybe we can have questions at the end.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I had to get out of this thing. End slideshow.
Okay. You just have to stop sharing. You see the stop sharing button? Yeah. Okay. let me know if you can see these.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, so a lot of the things that I was going to talk about have been mentioned already, which is good. Just to follow up on a couple of the food safety points that have been made. Yvonne mentioned this guide. This is an excellent place to find further information on meeting the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. This was put together by some of my colleagues at Perennia, and even if you're not exporting out of the province, it's a great way to get things up to snuff for the smaller and growing companies. A great resource to help you become market ready. This is just an example of one of the many downloadable forms. So if you're looking for help, like with your sanitation records or figuring out traceability, environmental planning, there's all kinds of checklists and downloadable forms in that guide. A lot of this has already been mentioned. I'll just point out a couple things. Record keeping is a best practice that I think at some firms, they haven't quite got there yet, but if you're doing record keeping, you can go back if you've had a problem and see if something was askew that day, and it might help you prevent the problem from happening again. And keeping your procedures as well as schedules quite tight is also important. If you're still trying to figure out what chemicals to use, your cleaning supply company can be a great resource, and they can also help you with selecting the proper protocols for cleaning. And just a note that cleaning involves removal of debris, a cleaning step, and a sanitization step. And if you don't do the cleaning step properly, your sanitizer will be less affected and you're kind of wasting money on it. Paying attention to cross-contamination and keeping your cleaning away from your areas where your product is also important. Tim talked about the sizer, and I just wanted to mention when I spoke to a few of the processors, they mentioned that the sizer was kind of a difficult area. It's tricky to clean, lots of crevices, and a lot of the equipment suppliers have mentioned don't use chemical on that piece of equipment. But I think it's important to sort of follow up and ask the questions, well, what shall I use on that? Maybe there's some specialized brushes that can be used. You can talk to your chemical supplier to see if they have something more gentle for that piece, because it is a bit of a hot spot. And as my colleagues in food safety would say, the goal is to have a smooth, cleanable, and impervious surface. And doing verification, so some swabbing after you've cleaned is also an excellent way to see if you're on track. And the food safety folks at Perennia can help with that if you're looking for some assistance. I just also wanted to mention on an inspection belt, the minimum lighting requirement is 540 lux. So that's something that you can check. So if you are at risk of having droppings go by, that will help your inspection staff to pull those things out. And we've already touched on field contamination and personal hygiene. Those details on those can also be found in that guide that Perennia has created. So we're going to switch gears a bit and talk about packaging. And I just wanted to make the point that in addition to your packaging being functional, catching the eye of the consumer, protecting the product, maintaining some humidity, but not too much, you also want to make sure that you're providing a sustainable package. People are concerned nowadays about climate change, carbon footprint, plastics in the environment. And here in Nova Scotia, we have an excellent team with Divert Nova Scotia. We actually have the best diversion rate in Canada and possibly in North America, keeping things out of landfills. So we're working with the rest of the country in meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So you've seen now about 2 years ago, we had our first plastics ban, and the Canada Plastics Pact will also be coming together to create another ban. So they're basically just trying to get rid of what they call problematic plastics that are not recyclable so they can keep them out of the natural environment. So things that are multi-layer are not very readily recyclable, but there are certain types of plastic that are. So PET, the polyethylenes, HDPE and LDPE, as well as polypropylene are acceptable plastics that can be circulated. So let's talk for a second about what we currently see with fresh packaging for fresh berries. Mostly nowadays, it's 5-pound boxes with some of the green fiberboard pints, and occasionally see other types of pints like this one on the bottom right, which is from north of Nuppy Farms. And that's a pint that was created by CSK, and they are here in Hansport, obtained through another local supplier, so distributor. So the one on the bottom right actually can take a cover, which makes it really good because the retailers nowadays are looking for fruit to be covered as part of their food safety requirements. And just a point, if you are still working with the curtain waxed cardboard boxes, just keep in mind that those are going to landfill. They're not recyclable. So if you haven't already talked to your supplier about the bio wax, which is available from various suppliers, both Maritime Paper and Veritiv I spoke to, and there is no price difference and no performance difference. So if you're not switching over to bio wax yet, it's time to do that. And let's get rid of those curtain wax boxes that go to landfill. I just put up it's a bit of a busy chart here, but on the left-hand side, you can see various types of possible fresh packaging and some pros and cons. This will be available later to look at in our full report, but just a couple of highlights. The cardboard box is large. Peter's going to address that in his talk. It's only got, the sort of 5 to 7 day shelf life and a fairly low margin. One way to improve on that might be to just look at a different size. So looking at a 2 or 3 pound box with some group ordering, a minimum order size of about 15,000 boxes, you could just switch that up to a different size. It might fit in a family's freezer a little bit more readily. It might be something that people can get through in those few days. The PET clamshell would require some type of absorbent pad, likely. This one's out of Quebec. It is for wild blueberries. Fully recyclable. You can see the product. You must ensure with your supplier that it is fully recyclable because some clamshells can contain a clarification compound. So just double check with your supplier. The 3 down below are all different versions of the fiberboard pint, the bottom one being made out of sugarcane. They all have I guess, some pros and cons, but the top one here, the blueberries with a sealed lid, and also the bottom with a cover, kind of meet that requirement to have your berries covered. All of these are about the same price per pint, except for the green fiberboard pint would be about half the price. That's all I'm going to say about that. There's lots more there, but we'll carry on. For frozen fruit, again, we have the current 5 pound box being the predominant format. We do have some stand-up pouches and some sizes, some various tubs of various sizes. Then those tubs are recyclable. We are going to look at a couple of different options that I didn't include tubs here, but they're certainly an option. We have, again, the cardboard box could be presented in a different size. It goes into the freezer nicely. All of these do. The stand-up pouch, I wanted to make the point that they are actually not generally readily recyclable because they're a multi-layer bag, and multi-layer is very difficult to recycle. But we are very fortunate nowadays. We have lots of new developments, one of which is the mono material, all PE, 100% recyclable pouch. And that is available through our local packaging company, Farnell, as well as Veritiv. They both have this option. It's a great option because it's got really good moisture and oxygen barrier properties. They have equal properties to the traditional stand-up pouch, and can be co-packed at Knoll Farms. Actually, they have the capability of packing berries for you. And speaking of Knoll Farms, the bottom example here is a multi-pack. I have the box here. So this multi-pack is a 6-pack with a PE bag. There are 6 little pouches of 57 grams each. Very convenient. We had some samples like this in our lab that we were giving away. And we also had some various bags, and everybody wanted to take this box home and try it. So I think it really presents the product. Peter will touch on that as well. Presents the product in a different way, and it's quite attractive to consumers. They didn't have a shelf life done on this, but I have had this box for 2 years and the berries were definitely decent. So I'm going to say that they're going to at least have a 1-year shelf life. So just to touch on freezing quickly, When we freeze berries, we want to encourage rapid freezing. It doesn't necessarily have to be IQF to give good quality, but the berries should be dry. So the smaller the ice crystals, the less damage to the fruit and less cracking of the skins and less seepage. So we want rapid freezing. And one way to do this, instead of freezing a whole pallet, is to just get racking and freeze your boxes on the racking, and that will cool them fairly quickly, and then you can palletize them afterwards. And you want to ensure your product is fully frozen prior to shipping. So for the last part of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the gold standard of fresh pack, which is modified atmospheric packaging. And MAP is used for a variety of fruits and vegetables. For example, the mixed salads that you buy would have an atmosphere in them that's elevated CO2, and it keeps the product longer because it slows down respiration. So the challenges we have with fresh wild blueberries have already been discussed. We've got temperature damage, mechanical damage, and the storability issue. The last one we can't control, the first two we can. So by bringing up the CO2 and dropping down oxygen, we slow respiration, which slows senescence, and that can extend shelf life. So a couple of folks have done studies on modified atmosphere packaging. Some of you may know Dr. Bob Prang. He was at the Kentville Research Station, AAFC, for many years, and he did MAP on 2 wild cultivar, I think it was Fundy and Blomidon, and he achieved 100% improvement in the shelf life, so 28 days instead of 14. That was done at a holding temperature of 0 degrees. And then a study out of Estonia was done by this group, Court et al., and they achieved a 37-day shelf life instead of 22 with an 8% CO2 level. Now, the optimal level for CO2, from what we can gather from literature, would be 8 to 10%. So, you know, if we could do that, we should be able to extend shelf life of our fresh berries. Now, before we would want to tackle this, we'd want to tackle the temperature issue and the pre-cooling. I talked to a company called Perfotech, and they have a really interesting technology where they measure the respiration rate of each lot, and then the machine can perforate the lidding material accordingly. And they said that they would only sell to a company that had that temperature of 5 degrees or less all the way through the system. So our little MAP trial that we did last summer, we got berries sort of the next morning from a processor, and they went through their blowing and sorting system. We put them into these overwrap bags. So over on the right, you'll see an overwrap bag, and that came from a company called, they are in Israel. It will come back to me. The brand, oh, here it is, Step Back. So they came from Step Back. It's called an Extend Overwrap Perforated Bag. And basically, the berries were in vented clamshells. They were allowed to breathe, and the CO2 level rises on its own. It's called a passive MAP. We stored the berries at 4 degrees and analyzed them 3 times a week, measured the CO2 and the weight, titratable acidity, and Brix. And then we actually went through the grading for defects to understand what was happening over time, and did some sensory. So we didn't have the fancy firmness tester that Travis mentioned this morning, but we did do a little bit of an assessment with sensory. So we did not actually achieve the 8 to 10% CO2, and that is just because the perforation level was a bit of a guess by the supplier. But we did get up to about a 2%. So, you know, from almost 0. So we did achieve a slight elevation in CO2, which is shown in the upper left graph there. And then on the right there, you can see that we measured the defects. We had no decay on any samples. And we figure using the 8% that Yvonne mentioned for provincial regulations. So 8% of defects, not decay, but softness. We achieved a 9-day shelf life as opposed to a 7-day shelf life. And there were no changes in Brix, TA, flavor was acceptable, and the berries, the texture was fine. So this is quite an encouraging snapshot. And I believe that if we were able to achieve the lower temperatures all the way through, as well as get our CO2 levels up to about 8 to 10%, we could have a significant impact on shelf life of a fresh offering. And just a quick look to, I always like to see what's coming down the pipeline. So a couple of new advances that are not really readily available yet. There's on the left side, there's a wrap that's made from a group at Harvard who's partnered with a group in Singapore. It's called Electrospun Nanocrystals, and it contains a bunch of natural antimicrobial agents, and they reduced the pathogen load by 5 logs using this covering on oranges. That's something that's not available commercially yet. Over on the right, we have a peel, and it's kind of interesting to go on their website and have a look. They have developed an edible film that can be dipped or sprayed on any fruit or vegetable, and it keeps moisture in and keeps oxygen out and can extend shelf life approximately 2 times for many of the products that have been tested. I think their poster child is the avocado, and they've got some really neat timeline videos on their website. That is only available to large players and mostly only in the US. There is a little bit in Canada, but it's all through the retailers and like really big partner growers. And I did contact them, and there's no samples available yet, but I expect in the future it will be available. We've already talked about a lot of these things, but paying attention to cooling, sanitation, record keeping. I just wanted to also throw out there, I believe that it's important to put on the packaging, wash berries before using and keep refrigerated. Those are messages that consumers should know, but they may not. And with the little result there, Tim showing that, the occasional dropping can get through, I think it's a valuable message to include on our packaging. And with that, we're going to leave it at that. You can try to differentiate with your package, and Peter's going to jump in and talk more about that. I have lots of different further reading if you're interested. And again, just wanted to say thanks to all of the partners, Perennia staff, and the participating farms for your help. We learned a lot from you. Thank you. Pass it over to you, Peter. I just have to unshare here.
All right, thanks very much, Nancy. And I guess for Peter B, I'm always the one when people say, Peter, I look, but they're always talking to you at these meetings, not me. You're supposed to wrap up at 2:30, right?
Yeah, we've got 15-20 minutes. We're good. Yeah.
Right. Well, I will do my best to get you a little bit back. All right. So my role to follow up on Tim and Nancy is really to share some insights on how we can look at fresh blueberries in the retail market and also the frozen as well. So I'm going to just cover a little bit. There was a lot of research that was done for the Wild Blueberry Producers Association, which I think was very valuable, and it's exciting to see that you did make those investments. So for me, I think some of the key takeaways for that, and this was focus groups and then also some online research conducted in Eastern Canada and the Eastern US. It's incredible the overall awareness about wild blueberries. And I think that's something that you should all be very excited about, because products do not always get that level of awareness. So I think that's an exciting thing to think about. It doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you want, or you're all going to work whatever you do, but it's great to have that starting point. People understand the health part of it, but we need to focus, instead of talking about the features, we need to focus on the benefits. And in part of your messaging, and if you choose to go to the market with fresh or frozen, I think that focusing on the benefits, not the features, are where will pay dividends for you. It's really important to know that blueberries right now are about a quarter of the berry category. And the berry category is very important in retail because it's impulse sales. It's at the front of the store in a lot of places. So the fact that blueberries, and we know a lot of those would be high bush blueberries, but the consumers are already buying these products. So if you can figure out how to get them to market in the right quality and some of those things, there are people definitely looking for them. And then the last thing, which I think is more and more on people's mind in the food industry recently, is just price. We have to know that there are a huge amount of inflationary pressures in the food industry, like a lot of others, and people are going to be more price conscious going forward. So that's just a reality. Everything seems to be moving, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a ceiling. So we just have to remember that people are price conscious. I think the timing right now, if you're interested in developing a fresh market for retail or some different frozen options for retail, I think your timing is really good. As we've come through the pandemic, the value of food, the whole awareness of our food industry has changed. When people saw empty shelves in grocery stores in Canada, they were like, holy smokes, you mean this doesn't really just happen? Like, you know, this is something I need to be concerned about. And so that awareness around the value of food has really increased. So I would say that people want to know what you're doing. They want to hear your story. They want to know about the products, and the closer you are to home, the more interested they are. So if you are looking at doing something, you have to remember that telling your story is part of that component. So the timing is good for that if it's a path that you want to go down. One thing I always want to share with people is, if you're going to make the shift from producing a commodity to a consumer packaged goods, you really need to change your mindset. So the first thing you really need to focus on is your sales process. So dealing with the customers, dealing with the retailers. And I know Yvonne mentioned that, you know, there are no guarantees and some of those kind of things, but there are a lot of things that you can do to develop a relationship and make it so that those customers want to work with you. And I can tell you, I know that wild blueberries is something they would like to have more of. So there is demand from consumers and customers, but you have to have that mindset that you're going to do what they need done. And if you don't want to go into it with that mindset, then I would suggest you don't do it, because you're just going to get frustrated and it's not going to work that well for you. So think about that. You also need to create demand. You know, as I said, wild blueberries, there's a great awareness and that kind of thing, but you need to create demand, and that means consumer marketing. So that means that if you're going to go into a fresh market business, I'd be out 2 or 3 weeks beforehand saying they're coming soon, it's a limited time, all these kind of things to create demand and get people excited. And then the last piece is that the food safety is not negotiable. They will not allow you to meet different requirements. So they have certain requirements, and make sure you talk to whichever retailer, whichever customer you're going to go into, and understand what their requirements are, because they're all different. They have different standards. They have different expectations, but make sure that you understand what they are, because they won't compromise them. And which is understandable. I mean, they can't. So you just have to know that going in. So let's take a look. We're going to first talk about the fresh, and then we'll talk about frozen. So my observations from sort of looking and visiting stores and the farm and that kind of thing. So the first thing I think, and Nancy already prefaced this, and Yvonne as well, is I think the package is way too big. You know, I look at things and say, where do we fit in the category? And we fit in the berry category. So when you think about that category, the biggest thing we might see is a 2-pound strawberry, which is really not that big of a SKU. It's not a huge part of it. Strawberries are really, the number one is a 1-pound SKU. Blueberries are pints, and then blackberries and raspberries are in 6 ounce. So the 2.5 or the 5 pound, like, it's just, in my opinion, too big. I know it moves more volume, but from my perspective with consumers today, it's just too big. And if you think about what's happened in the potato category, where 10 years ago, or I was going to say when I worked at a store, but that was more than 10 years ago, you know, 10-pound, even 20-pound potatoes, where that was an item we carried. You would never see a 20-pound potato in a store anymore. And a lot of the volume in that category is shifted to the minis, right? So people change. So we have to adapt with them. The shelf life, if you're going to do a fresh program and you're going to do it through the retailers, not sort of a market kind of model, but more through the conventional retailers, the Sobeys, the Loblaws of the world, I really think you need to have 10 days shelf life. And that allows for some time for it to get to the store, and time for the consumer time to get to the store, time to sell, and then time for the consumer at home. So I would really be shooting for 10 days. Now, Nancy mentioned way more than that on some of the modified atmospheres, so that might be an opportunity. But we need to extend, we've got to get the processes in place to allow you to have a better shelf life. And I'd encourage you to look at distribution options too. Perhaps there's ways to partner. Perhaps there's a DSD solution, a direct store delivery solution at one retailer, a warehouse solution at another one. We have to be flexible in this, because distribution is one of your biggest challenges. The sooner we can get this product to the shelf, the better off we will all be. So I would really encourage you to explore different options for distribution, and how we have to cut days out. And that's what the focus of any kind of a project should be, is to cut that out. So as far as what I would see, I would encourage you to look at a 9-ounce container. As Nancy mentioned, if you're going to be in retail, it needs a lid. So 9 ounces positions you between the 6-ounce raspberry and blackberry and the pint of high bush blueberries. And they're going to have those products. That's the reality of the category. But it gives you a place to be that's a little different, where if they price you the same as the blueberries, the high bush blueberries, then you're going to get a premium per pound. Or if they price you a little lower, because your price per unit is lower, then you're going to see a little bit lower retail, which might encourage volume as well. So I would look at something like that and see if you can find something. As Nancy said, there's so many options for packaging, but you really can't differentiate your offer with the packaging that you choose. So try to find that. I really think you need a coordinated program. So that means instead of a bunch of growers coming to one retailer, I think you need to find ways where there can be more of a coordinated effort. So one person can go and say, we're going to have wild blueberries starting, and we're going to be able to supply you, through the season that way, as opposed to all trying to do it, because it's a challenge for the retailers. There's no doubt about it. So if you can simplify it at all, it'll be better for them. And then the other thing I really, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you need to create demand before the season. You need to get awareness out there. And yes, I know a lot of people know in the summer it's when wild blueberries come, but you need to be really as specific as you can. In 2 weeks, look for them in the store and that kind of thing. So you have to have some investment in that kind of thing, whether it's at the retail level with the stores, or online, or both, that kind of thing. And I think they're more and more willing to work with you on these things because they want the product. So they're more and more willing to work with you. And so to try and understand the return, I just did it based on $30 a flat delivered to the retailer, always a delivered price on the retail side. And I just took out some of the costs that you would incur, and ends up about $3.38 per pound would be the net amount after you back out some of those costs. Now, I appreciate there's some things you are probably going to have to do differently. I listened to Yvonne and how her presentation about fresh pack and that kind of thing. So, but my estimate from what I understand about the category and looking at it during the wild blueberry season is that if you were to look at a 9-ounce container, you probably could sell that for about $30 a flat, and then you can work it backwards from there based on your costs. That packaging that I put in the slide there is one of the ones I've always felt was good with blueberries. That was over in Europe. We saw those, but it talks to the consumer and talks about the benefits of the product as opposed to just what it is. I mean, people look at it, they know what it is. So talk to the benefits. But so that $3.38 a pound is what I would see. And then obviously you've got all your costs of production and harvest and processing to figure out. But based on the retail and working backwards with the retailer making about a 45% margin in produce, that would be where I would see it coming in. So now we'll just shift gears and talk frozen. So when I look at that category in retail, obviously it's already there. Nancy already showed some pictures of some of the different offerings. One of the things I find frustrating with it is that it's all line price. So a 600-gram bag of strawberries and wild blueberries and pineapple and mango and whatever else they have there, it's all the same price. So there's no real differentiation for anything there. And I think it's a pretty limited story they're telling. I think they could do a better job telling that story. So, but I don't think you can take them on because you probably aren't going to get the extra shelf space, and it's hard to be the same. So I'd like to look at some different options. I think Nancy already explained the Knoll Farms option, which is the individual sort of single serving kind of idea where people just put that on their yogurt or in the smoothie or whatever. I think that's a really interesting option. I would encourage you to look, if you're going to go to a frozen program, to look at maybe a 454-gram bag, not a 600-gram bag, the same size as all the other fruit. So differentiate it. The whole fresh frozen piece, I think, requires some education. And to be honest with you, I go back to my Loblaw days. I remember somebody from Clearwater, seafood was one of my departments as well as produce. And they talked to me about this fresh frozen piece with scallops. And at first I was like, no, I want fresh. And they're like, no, Peter, fresh frozen is actually better because we freeze them out on the water closer to when we harvest them, as opposed to going through the whole supply chain. So I think we need to do some more education with people and help them understand. And there's a difference between fresh frozen and IQF and what the benefits are. So I think that's another way that you can differentiate and find those opportunities. Part of it is merchandising as well. So where it is merchandised in the store, maybe not back in the frozen food beside all those big, all those bags of frozen fruit. So we can find different places in the store to merchandise. And that was one of the ideas we had, was to put it in a freezer in the produce department. So perhaps some of you have seen Toppets, which is a frozen herb program, and they put frozen chests in the produce department and convinced the retailers that it was really an extension of produce, not a frozen food item. And we see this program, actually, if you go into Sobeys right now, this is a program that's in there in the seafood department, where it's a sort of a standalone freezer, but they're putting products in there. I mean, it's quite it must be expensive because it's like a TV screen on the back. I don't know if you need to go to that level of execution, but it's a standalone piece. And the beauty of putting your frozen blueberries into produce is you get the consumer at the beginning of the shop. The people, most stores, you go to produce first. So it's a chance for you to interrupt the shop on the way through. And if we did go to a 454 gram bag and it retailed for $5.99, which would be my estimate, the retailer usually in frozen would make about 30%. In produce, they'd want to make a little more, which we talk about, but you can see what that return is. And again, it's always a delivered price. So you'd have to factor in packaging and distribution and a cardboard box to put it in and all those kind of things, sales and marketing, because you have to do the promotion piece, but it's a different place to play in the store. But I think that there are both opportunities for fresh and for the frozen blueberries, but it's a different mindset, and we really have to focus on an entire program. It's not just, oh, I have product. It's an entire program. You work in advance and develop the relationship and agree on numbers and all those kind of things. So Peter, I will stop sharing now and stop talking so fast. But I do believe that there's certainly some opportunities, but it requires a real coordinated effort. It's not a slam dunk. And the volumes, I did put in the report what I suggest. It's not going to take your 65 million pounds out of the gate, right? It's something that takes time to build, but it could be right for some people.
Excellent. So again, a lot of information on those last three talks. I wonder if there's any question for Tim, Nancy, or Peter.